Good evening and welcome to our midweek service of Calvary Baptist Church. I'm Tim Smith, pastor of the church here in our auditorium with a number of our church people. Glad to have you join online and glad to have you folks in the auditorium with me. We've been looking on Wednesday nights through the summer and into the fall from the book of Numbers, and we're right at the end of it now, last two chapters of it. I'd like to have us turn in the book of Numbers to chapter 35. Israel is now having come out of Egypt and through faithlessness was denied entrance to the promised land, was condemned to wander 40 years until the first generation had all perished in the wilderness. But now there's a new generation, and now they're back on the verge of the promised land, and they're about to go in, and there's some final instructions that God gives before they are going to mount their offensive against Jericho and into the promised land. Of course, Deuteronomy is basically preparation book of summarizing the laws, but the end of the book of Numbers, they're right on the verge of the promised land. Part of the instructions relates to the issue of the justice that's going to be required in the land, that the land not be polluted. So I'd like to go ahead and just read, if you could follow along in your copy of God's Word, Numbers chapter 35 and verse number 10. Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall appoint cities to be cities of refuge for you, that the manslayer who kills any person accidentally may flee there. They shall be cities of refuge for you from the avenger, that the manslayer may not die until he stands before the congregation in judgment. And of the cities which you give, you shall have 6 cities of refuge. You shall appoint 3 cities on this side of the Jordan, and 3 cities you shall appoint in the land of Canaan, which will be cities of refuge. These 6 cities shall be for refuge for the children of Israel, for the stranger, and for the sojourner among them, that anyone who kills a person accidentally may flee there. But if he strikes him with an iron implement so that he dies, he is a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. And if he strikes him with a stone in the hand by which one could die, and he does die, he is a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. Or if he strikes him with a wooden hand weapon by which one could die, and he does die, he is a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. The avenger of blood himself shall put the murderer to death. When he meets him, he shall put him to death. If he pushes him out of hatred, or while lying in wait, hurls something at him so that he dies, or in enmity he strikes him with his hand so that he dies, the one who struck him shall surely be put to death. He is a murderer. The avenger of blood shall put the murderer to death when he meets him. However, if he pushes him suddenly without enmity, or throws anything at him without lying in wait, or uses a stone by which man could die, throwing it at him without seeing him, so that he dies, while he was not his enemy or seeking his harm, then the congregation shall judge between the manslayer and the avenger of blood, according to these judgments. So the congregation shall deliver the manslayer from the hand of the avenger of blood, and the congregation shall return him to the city of refuge where he had fled, and he shall remain there until the death of the high priest, who is anointed with the holy oil. But if the manslayer at any time goes outside the limits of the city of refuge where he fled, and the avenger of blood finds him outside the limits of his city of refuge, and the avenger of blood kills the manslayer, he shall not be guilty of blood, because he should have remained in his city of refuge until the death of the high priest. But after the death of the high priest, the manslayer may return to the land of his possession. And these things shall be a statute of judgment to you throughout your generations and all your dwellings. Whoever kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death on the testimony of witnesses. But one witness is not sufficient testimony against a person for the death penalty. Moreover, you shall take no ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall surely be put to death. And you shall take no ransom for him who has fled to his city of refuge, that he may return to dwell in the land before the death of the priest. So you shall not pollute the land where you are, for blood defiles the land, and no atonement can be made for the land for the blood that is shed on it, except by the blood of him who shed it. Therefore do not defile the land which you inhabit, for the midst of which I dwell, for I the Lord dwell among the children of Israel. So in these moments before entrance to the land, the Lord is giving instructions about justice in the land and the necessity that the land not be guilty of blood, that there not be unjust, law-enforced killing, murdering, that murder be treated justly. And here, this rooted in the biblical teaching that equates justice with murder with the death penalty. That capital punishment was required in Israel because the land would be polluted with blood. That is, every other crime or sin that Israel had various blood sacrifices of animals to offer as a way to atone for the purification. But an animal life was not a substitute for a human life. And so if there was murder, those animal sacrifices would be insufficient. And so if there was a murder that was never treated with justice, the land would be guilty. So God is concerned about the value of human life. And Numbers 35, at least verses 10 through 34, are really rooted in the sanctity of life before God. And this teaching going back to the idea that God has made man in his image, and as Genesis 9 tells us, because he's in his image, if a man shed a man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. So this chapter is devoted to justice through capital punishment for murder. God doesn't want there to be violence in the land that is not treated justly. But it's also concerned not just with the question of murder, but that which might look like murder but isn't. There might be a rise of passions from the relatives of the person who is killed, but that person might have been killed innocently. And we can certainly understand, and the chapter has a fairly realistic view of life, that sometimes accidents happen. And sometimes accidents are closely related to people being involved with those accidents. They are the cause of the accident. They're so intimately involved that a family member might want vengeance against someone who really, through just a fluke of fate or accident, they kill someone. And so the chapter is interested in determining what real justice looks like in these. And so God commanded that Israel establish principles and have forethought into handling cases of this justice. And it has an intense realization that murder needs to be responded to with justice, but sometimes it could get out of control, and things that aren't murder could be treated as murder. So God establishes 6 cities of refuge, so that if someone kills someone accidentally, and they are being blamed, they are being considered as guilty by the family members of the victim, they are to go to these cities and have protection. Those cities would be responsible to protect these people who committed what we might call manslaughter or something along those lines. And so they're to protect them until there's some sense of understanding about what actually happened, and a verdict of the guilt or the innocence of the person that's accused by others of doing this wrong. Now, understand, in this time of Israel's history, they don't have the national apparatus that we come to know nations have. That their justice system, they don't have a police force, they don't have a prison system, they don't have all this apparatus of judges dedicated to these kind of things. So this is treated more on a tribal level, of an association of tribes, where the justice system is rooted in the feeling of vengeance of family members. It's the blood relative of the victim who is pursuing this justice. It's not the district attorney, it's not prosecuting attorneys or anything like that. It's the blood relative who is obviously impassioned about the loss of someone. So the chapter is rooted in the concept of the sacredness of life, in not having life be taken unjustly, and also in fairness of an accuracy of punishment that fits a crime. Well, think with me about this in several categories, just beginning with the discernment that this chapter requires. This chapter requires an evaluation of whether someone being accused of murder is actually guilty of murder. So we don't really have the outlines of what a trial looks like, but we see kind of the basic elements that would produce a trial, that would produce some kind of formal assembly, some kind of rugged determination of the guilt or the innocence of a person being accused. Obviously, these are relative to our own times, where justice is always such a critical matter. And there's always opportunities for nations to break down and to have a great turmoil when justice is not done or not perceived to be done. And so these are relevant things to us. I know I've been thinking a lot about this recently and have obviously concerns and prayers for our own nation, and that justice both be done and understood to be done, and a people willing to live in a world where sometimes bad things happen, but you really can't blame somebody for it. When bad things happen, of course, our human nature wants to blame somebody for it. But sometimes things happen and it's a bad thing that happened, but you can't really blame somebody because nobody really intended for the thing bad to happen. So that's the first distinction that we see in this chapter when God is telling Israel to discern whether this is murder or not. So in Numbers 35, verse 16, really on down to verse number 24, there's kind of an outlining in kind of the way the Hebrew language and God's commands of that age work. Basically, it kind of gives case studies in different ways that someone might kill somebody with iron, with stone, with wood. And then it's kind of the way the Bible is talking about lots of different ways you could kill somebody. And the basic thread through all of it is whether the person intends to do it. Does he intend harm? So you see that for example, in verse 16, if he strikes him with an iron implement so that he dies, he is a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. If he strikes him with a stone in the hand by which one could die, and he does die, he is a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. Or if he strikes him with a wooden hand weapon by which one could die, and he does die, he is a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. So basically all that's saying, if the person is using some implement with an intent to harm. Now actually the intent here doesn't necessarily have to be to murder. If he just he's angry with him and he intends to wound him, but he kills him, it's still considered murder. He's done this act, he intended harm, and he caused a murder. And so in that case, he is to be considered guilty of murder. Whether or not he intended to actually, if he planned to kill him, definitely. But even if he didn't plan to kill him, if he just strikes him out of intent to harm him and does kill him, it would also be murder. That's in contrast to a later situation. For example, in verse 22, however, if he pushes him suddenly without enmity, or throws anything at him without lying in wait, or uses a stone by which a man could die, throwing it at him without seeing him, so that he dies, while he is not his enemy or seeking his harm. Then the congregation shall judge between the manslayer and the avenger of blood concerning these judgments. So in other words, if somebody accidentally kills somebody, they throw something and they didn't see the person and they strike him and he dies. If he, pushes him, maybe playfully, maybe, maybe even some rudeness, but does not intend to harm him, but is perhaps a fluke of nature, they trip over something, that person is not to be considered guilty of murder. And the congregation is responsible to discern the difference between those things. So, all death is bad, And all death caused by humans is bad, but not all of it is to be considered guilty of murder, and therefore the punishment of capital punishment related to that. Now, our minds actually go to a third category that isn't discussed very much in the Bible, and that is, what about self-defense? And the Bible never really tackles this head on. But there's a couple indications that would lead us to use common sense from biblical principles to determine how to think about self-defense. For example, there's an interesting text in Exodus 22 that can be related to this question of self-defense. Exodus 22, verse 2, if the thief, in the context is someone who is stealing someone's sheep or oxen, if the thief is found breaking in and he is struck so that he dies, there shall be no guilt for his bloodshed. But if the sun has risen on him, there shall be guilt for his bloodshed. He should make full restitution. If he has nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. If the thief is certainly found alive in his hand, whether it is an ox or donkey or sheep, he shall restore double. So this is actually about thievery, robbery, but it does touch upon the question of what happens if a thief is killed by the owner. And the text basically, in kind of the Hebrew way, in a case study way that we have to kind of extract out the principle, basically it says if it happens at night when the thief breaks in, and the assumption is scares the person to death. So he kills him. He's like, someone's breaking my house. I better protect my family. I better strike back. And he kills him. He's not to be considered guilty. But it says if it happens in the daytime, and I think the assumption is if he sees him coming, if he knows it, and he has other alternatives, he should do anything but kill him. He should only kill at the last resort. So I think that's basically the way that we have come to understand the self-defense. You can't just kill anybody that walks into your house illegally, but if your life or your family are threatened, then there is just cause. And I think that's basically the way, although the details are probably always going to be argued about, but I think the Bible would side with that. Then you could look at many texts where the Bible encourages individuals to protect themselves. That Israel was sometimes commanded, the enemy's on the doorstep. And it doesn't say, let them come in and kill you. It says, get the army, turn your plow shears into swords and get ready for battle because you should defend yourself. And even Jesus, although he's reserved about the sword, even says that one sword is enough. That is, we're not going to go out fight wars here, but at least we should have a sword to defend ourselves if we're attacked by robbers, I think is the thought that Jesus makes there. So essentially self-defense, when it's not it's the last resort, is a biblically justified killing. So think about the Bible's teaching here about how you determine this, how you determine guilt. There's a high standard of determining guilt. As we understand through history and maybe just common sense, it's easy to get this stuff wrong. There's a lot of human passions and there's a lot of uncertainty that goes into these cases. You get the family of the victim and the friends of the victim who are outraged, and so they want revenge. And then you get outsiders who don't know anything about what happened, who might take one side or the other. And so you get all these differing, and then of course the family of and the friends of the person who did the killing, you got their passion. So you got to realize it's easy for wrong things to be multiplied. It's easy for injustice to be continued. So the Bible has pretty stringent views on how to do this and how easy it is to falsely accuse someone. And then, of course, with the death penalty, there's no remedy for that. if you make that mistake, you make the ultimate mistake. You can't undo that. So there is a carefulness about these things. And so the whole chapter of Numbers 35, just by a casual reading of it, tells you God wanted Israel to take this seriously and carefully. He's giving these detailed instructions, and he's telling the community, you need to be careful about this. So, back in our text in Numbers 35, in verse 33, so you shall not pollute the land where you are, for blood defiles the land, and no atonement can be made for the land for the blood that is shed on it, except by the blood of him who shed it. Therefore do not defile the land which you inhabit. It is the midst of which I dwell, for I the Lord dwell among the children of Israel. So that whole chapter is summed up in that kind of call, for God lives in this land, and God doesn't want there to be injustice, and so he's calling, this whole chapter is designed for the community to insist upon justice, both in finding the murderer and giving due punishment, or protecting someone who accidentally killed someone from the avenger. So all this is very carefully laid out to seek justice. So one of the qualifications here is really the certainty of guilt. And there's many texts in the Bible that talk about this. For example, in Numbers 35 and verse 30, whoever kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death on the testimony of witnesses, but one witness is not sufficient testimony against a person for the death penalty. So in other words, if someone really did kill somebody and there was only one witness, that was not sufficient to condemn that person. There had to be more than one witness. And so that's a high standard for justice in this matter. There had to be multiple witnesses, and obviously it's easy to see why, because if one person hates another person, they could legally kill them by falsely accusing them. Whereas two and more people are harder to get to conspire. We'll see in a moment another reason why that's especially powerful to have more than one witness. So there's this certainty of guilt. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 19 and verse 15 with another statement about how important certainty was. In verse number 15, one witness shall not rise against a man concerning any iniquity or any sin that he commits. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, the matter shall be established. So in verse number 18, and the judges shall make careful inquiry, and indeed, if the witness is a false witness who has testified falsely against his brother, then you shall do to him as he thought to have done to his brother. In other words, they are really evaluating the certainty of this, and they're suspicious of false accusations. So why does it say 2 or 3? Which is it? Is it 2 or 3 witnesses? My reading of that, when it says 2 or 3 witnesses, it says 2 is good, except if you think they might be in collusion. And if you start getting an inkling that there's something doesn't sound right here, you need more than 2. So if you have any suspicion about the witnesses, if they're clearly 2 independent witnesses, then that's one view of certainty. But if it seems like they are in concert, like the witnesses that rose up against Jesus, there should be doubt about that. There's also a command here that crowds not be followed. Look at Exodus chapter 23. Verse 1, you shall not circulate a false report. Do not put your hand with the wicked to be to be an unrighteous witness. You shall not follow a crowd to do evil, nor shall you testify in dispute as to turn aside after many who to pervert justice. So one of the principles of justice, pretty well established through the ages, is that crowds are really bad at determining justice, that mobs are easily manipulated. And there's something about human nature that we really can't go into tonight, but there's something about crowds that are pretty untrustworthy. And you start getting mobs of people and crowds of people, you get all their passions going, and they probably have 1,000 personal injustices that they're like, oh, this is a chance. And the Bible says, don't trust crowds. And then you see that in the New Testament constantly. The book of Acts has a very disfavorable view of crowds because they're constantly causing the apostles all kinds of hardship. It's easy to get crowds going, to get them incited. You see it in the death of Jesus. The crowds are manipulated. So anyway, the basic principle is be careful about crowds and that mob mentality. This has to happen without that kind of, that group mentality that's demanding some kind of action. We already mentioned, but I'll mention formally, the two or more witnesses. In other words, be sure that there's multiple evidences of this. Now, of course, we have a little bit different situation in modern times than in ancient world, where we have police forensics that DNA sometimes is a pretty powerful witness and can come pretty close to absolute certainty in some occasions. Now, even there, we have to be very careful because it's easy for there to be polluted evidence, and so that's important that the judicial system and the legal process thinks carefully about how those things might happen. But I think the modern world basically would say DNA is pretty much can be an eyewitness in certain settings. But anyway, has to be sufficient witnesses. A fifth principle is that witnesses had to suffer the threat of execution. Are the possibility of being the executioners. It's one thing to be a witness that wants somebody else to do the dirty work, but it's another thing to actually lay your hand to the task, to be the one to actually do it. And so the Bible said that those who were to be witnesses were to be the first of the executioners. So, for example, Deuteronomy chapter 17. Verse 6, whoever is deserving of death shall be put to death on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. He shall not be put to death on the testimony of 1 witness. The hands of the witnesses shall be the first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hands of all people. So why the witness be the first one? Because there's the moral courage that's required to kill somebody should be the same as accusing the person. So we've actually seen this. One of the problems with our social media world is that it's a lot easier to say things when you're not facing the person than when you are facing them. That you can say all kinds of things, and if you're not there, you're not facing the person. But it's amazing how more timid people get when they actually have to look somebody in the eye, when they actually have to see the hurt that they're causing. And so the text says, we take this serious enough that the person who's going to accuse and be a witness has to be willing to throw the stone. They have to be willing to be the executioner. I think that for that reason, in Jesus' day, in the New Testament times, they didn't allow women to be witnesses. Not always because they didn't trust women to be truthful. They didn't trust women to throw the first stone. They thought that women were more likely to be reluctant to take someone's life, and I'm not sure whether it's true, but I guess it could make sense. So anyway, that level of seriousness that I'd be willing to take this person's life, that's how sure I am of my testimony. So in other words, we're talking about a pretty high standard of guilt here. In America, it's beyond the shadow of a doubt. This is even higher than that. This is pretty close to certainty that it happened if you're going to take somebody's life. The other principle here is that of what happens to a false witness. And the verse we just read a short time ago said The penalty for being a false witness, for lying, is what the accused would have been facing. So in this case, a capital case, a false witness should face death himself. So it's really upping the ante. You better be sure that you are telling the truth, because if we prove that you are lying, you're going to get what this person would have faced. So it's really an intimidating force against people witnessing falsely to take someone's life. The sixth principle here is that sometimes cases were just too hard for people to figure out. And so they had experts that were called upon to see those cases. So in Deuteronomy chapter 17 again, verse 18, verse 8. If a matter arises which is too hard for you to judge between degrees of guilt for bloodshed, between one judgment or another, or between one punishment or another, matters of controversy within your gates, then you shall arise and go up to the place which the Lord your God chooses. And you shall come to the priests, the Levites, and to the judge there in those days, and inquire of them, and they shall pronounce upon you the sentence of judgment. In other words, when these cases are tough and it's kind of hard, don't just call a panel of people who don't even know law and don't even understand what's going on, but get the highest judges in the land who understand these things. So there not be an unfair verdict because people are ignorant of judicial matters. Then, number 7, there was a mandatory execution of the guilty. That there was to be no qualifications that would allow someone who was found guilty of murder of not being executed. So, Numbers chapter 35. And verse number 31, moreover, you shall take no ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall surely be put to death. In other words, if a rich person kills somebody and they have enough money to make it everybody's worthwhile to let him go, you're not allowed to do it. You're not allowed to show some kind of leniency just because somebody is very, is well off or can pay fancy lawyers or that there's to be no discriminatory treatment here, that if a person is clearly guilty, they ought to, by God's standard, suffer this penalty. So the person who's supposed to do this is a blood relative, and that's kind of the context of the chapter, is that the person who is pursuing this, who's basically the prosecuting attorney and the first of the executioners, is a family relative. So you see that in verse number 25, so the congregation shall deliver the manslayer from the hand of the avenger of blood. That's the person who is seeking. He's the prosecuting attorney. He's also the one witnessing and the one who is going to lead the execution, the avenger of blood. There's a case that's kind of sounds a little strange to us in here, is that someone that killed someone accidentally and is accused by a next of kin or the family can go to one of these cities. And if he's declared innocent, he has to stay in that city. And if he stays in that city, the avenger of blood cannot, the person who's angry about this, cannot go in there and kill them without himself being considered a murderer. However, there is a case that is an exception to that. So, for example, in verse 26, but if the manslayer at any time goes outside the limits of the city of refuge where he fled, and the avenger of blood finds him outside the limits of his city of refuge, and the avenger of blood kills the manslayer, he shall not be guilty of blood, because he should have remained in his city of refuge until the death of the high priest. Wow, so what's going on here? This kind of violates our sense of justice, because if the guy's innocent, what difference does it make what city he's in? We kind of think if he's in any city, he should not be treated like this. So why does God give the avenger of blood permission? What I read that as is God realizes that when someone's life is taken, people are upset about it and something wrong happened. And it's clearly wrong, even though you can't say this person is guilty of murder, other people are upset with him because he was part of this instrument. So it's kind of a way of saying people in some respects are right in thinking justice has been violated, even though they can't prove it in a court of law. And so one of the ways God does, he handles this, is says, you are under some mercy until the high priest dies. In other words, somebody really should die because of this thing. Somebody should bear some kind of guilt because of this. And it wasn't this person's fault. They were only doing, something that anybody would be doing. It just happened to prison death. But you could also understand the family member is really upset about it. And so God seems to say, I understand that. He's protected until some kind of atonement takes place. And that atonement is the death of the high priest. In other words, the death of the high priest is a substitute. It's the substitute for just the sense of some injustice has gone on here, even though it's frustrating to the family that we couldn't do anything about it. So it's kind of a helpful, at least theologically, I'm not sure how the family felt about this law, but they're at least given this idea that God does see that we're hurting and something bad happened, and I'm not sure whether they rose to hate the high priest. But he kind of bears the brunt of the guilt of that's no one else's fault. So the refuge is for this innocent person until the death of the high priest. Well, there's a few objections to the death penalty. I can't take a lot of time with this, but just to mention this, a couple of things that people say. First of all, God showed mercy to several murderers, famous murderers in the Bible. Cain is a murderer. He does not get the death penalty. Moses kills someone. He becomes the greatest leader in history. David kills Uriah the Hittite, has him killed. And God forgives all these people. So if God forgives them, we should forgive them too. Well, the problem with that is that God is God and we aren't. And we are given prescriptions about how to handle justice. And God is allowed to show mercy in ways that we are not always permitted to. And so it's really not a valid objection because God knows perfectly his plans and purposes and situations and showed mercy to these three and others. But on the other hand, God brought death to many people that he saw as guilty that we probably would have been like, I'm not sure he should have been. So, for example, poor the guy that touches the Ark of the Covenant, he's struck down instantly. God's God, and we would never do something like that, but God in his justice did that. Another objection is that Jesus has superseded the law and he taught love and not vengeance. Well, there's no place that actually says that Jesus never tells us not to follow this. There's a case that is sometimes brought up of the case of John 8 where the woman is brought before Jesus, committed, caught in the act of adultery. And she's supposed to die at the hand, because of the law. And so Jesus, in that situation, Jesus lets her go free. Well, first of all, about that story in John 8, it's a trap. The whole thing is set up to bring condemnation on Jesus because the Jews are not allowed to exercise the death penalty. The Romans forbid it. They were not allowed to. So the whole thing is a trap to try to get Jesus to either get the Romans mad at him or the Jews mad at him. And either way, he was going to be upset. And so Jesus' response is a masterful response in an impossible question that he couldn't possibly answer. And what is his response? His response is not that she shouldn't be executed. His response is, let the one who is guiltless cast the first stone. Now, Jesus isn't saying you have to be perfect to exact justice. What he's saying is, let your conscience say, if you are not guilty somehow, blameless before the community, then do this. In other words, Jesus could be suggesting that they haven't followed the law. And in one way, we know they didn't follow the law. And that is, there's only one. And the Old Testament insisted that if you catch somebody in adultery, you have two people. And so even in that situation, we're like, where's the man? So Jesus is saying, are you going to say before the law, seeing that there's only one person here, that you're following the law? In other words, their own conscience would say, oh, we're not really following the law. Also, where are the two witnesses or three witnesses? They don't, are they? So Jesus is kind of challenging, are you doing this the way the law said? So none of them can do it. Perhaps another thing that could be saying is, Jesus is saying, which of you hasn't committed adultery? And that's a possible thing that's going on. Anyway, none of them are willing to follow through. And so why doesn't Jesus command it? Well, because Jesus was not an eyewitness. Jesus didn't have two witnesses. Jesus didn't have the man, so he wouldn't have been permitted to execute her either, or call for her execution. So basically, that doesn't handle the question of capital punishment. It's basically Jesus' masterful response to an impossible question. When Jesus does talk about murder in Matthew 5, he compares anger to it, but he doesn't say it's no problem. He says anger in God's sight is guilt-worthy as murder. He doesn't say don't execute murderers. He says don't even be angry, because you'll face God's judgment. So he doesn't really handle the question of capital punishment, but he leaves open that the biblical teaching could stand and should stand. So, love and justice cannot be enemies. If someone's going to say, Jesus taught love, so don't ever have capital punishment, well, you could say that for every other crime too. And I don't think anybody really believes you could have civilization if there's no justice system, that everybody gets to go free. Or if you take just teaching that says if someone slaps your face, give them the other side. And we really want governments to do that. So can you imagine a government that says, someone stole $10,000 from you, here, take all of your money and give it to the criminal. Nobody really would say that. So you can't pit love versus justice. Governments always have a hard time with love because it's not their skin. It's somebody else's money they're spending. It's somebody else's lives they're sacrificing. So to think governments can be loving it's hard to think through that, because they're always spending somebody else's. They aren't really sacrificing themselves. Like Jesus' teaching, turn the other cheek, that's a personal thing in a personal relationship. It's not a judicial philosophy. So Jesus' teaching of love does not go against capital punishment. One argument is that capital punishment doesn't deter murder. There's been studies that suggest that countries that have capital punishment don't have worse murder rates than countries that do. States that have capital punishment don't necessarily have lesser murder rates than states that don't have it. So I don't know about that. One thing I know about statistics is there's some line about lies and statistics, is that it's pretty easy to get statistics to say what you want, and just because there's not a high murder rate, you don't know why there isn't. But another thing is that Bible doesn't really make that point. Now, the Bible never really says the point is deterrence. The Bible says the point is justice. The Bible says if someone's life has been taken unjustly, their life is to be held in the same regard. And it doesn't really talk about deterrence. Now, I expect there probably is some deterrence, but the Bible, this doesn't really rise or fall upon whether you can prove deterrence or not. Is it inhumane? Well, I guess it depends on your perspective here. But the Bible says humanity is the image of God. And the image of God is sanctified, belonging to God. And so God is really the standard of what humane is. And God says that the most humane thing is to bring justice. Now, granted, not every family member or victim has a sense of equal vengeance, but you can understand a lot of families, victims, or friends, children, spouse, who doesn't find it humane to let murderers go on without some kind of retribution. Humane in what way? Humanity is related to how valuable we think a life is. And if a life is taken, then God says the humane thing is to justly take the person responsible's life in turn. Some people point out the inconsistency of Old Testament teaching, that there are quite a few commands in the Bible that result in the death penalty, and hardly anybody in our time thinks that they should be applied today. For example, breaking a Sabbath day is a capital offense. Rebelling against your parents is a capital offense. Taking the name of the Lord in vain, worshiping a false god, are all capital offenses. And then to add that, there's mixing of different kind of fabrics in one garment is a capital offense. So people say, you guys are inconsistent. If you really believe capital punishment, you should be killing everybody that wears mixed threads in their clothes. Well, we need to make a distinction here, is that some of those commandments are in the context of Israel's life before God. And the capital punishment is rooted before Israel even exists. In Genesis 9, God pronounces this long before Abraham even exists. This is in the time of Noah. So the taking of a life is not an institution of Israel related to its purity laws and its religious laws. This is a human institution, something that was given before Israel, and something that's repeated in Romans 13. Romans 13 says that God gives the government the sword. And the implication is the government has a God-given right to execute somebody for these kind of offenses. And so that's not Israel either. So there's a difference between some of the laws related to Israel that are no longer part of civil society or even church, that are not relevant to capital punishment, which are related to the taking of human life. So some final thoughts. What are some things, how do we think about this? Let me just summarize some things I believe we can find. We need an impartial judicial system, which requires some hard work to have a judicial system devoted to finding justice and executing that justice. Second, in any case, there needs to be a thorough investigation. Like Numbers 35 says, you don't want to be careless about this. You don't want to execute the innocent. You don't want to let the guilty go free. So there needs to be some gathering of witnesses and testimony, and considering the worthiness of the witnesses and how accurate they are. There needs to be a high standard and a certainty of guilt. We should push to have no innocent people executed. Now, probably that's going to happen sometime just because the way life is complicated, but our ambition should be a very high standard of guilt. A fourth principle that I see here is that there should be no prejudicial treatment, that people should be considered apart from social economic categories, that political categories or those things should not be relevant, race should not be relevant, friends should not be tarnish this judgment. We should deny the rule by mob. That is so dangerous, that people who are far from an event don't know anything except their own little supply of information, that they get some partial, those mob things are really dangerous. And so we should deny the rule by mob. Sixth, there should be severe consequences for perjury. There needs to be a threat that you can't just make up tales and expect to go scot-free, but there needs to be severe consequences for lying, false witness. Seventh, there needs to be a deliberate process, but it needs to be short. And this idea that someone can go 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years without justice is ridiculous. There needs to be some short period. So when we're talking about whether laws deter, whether capital punishment deters, how would you know? Because if you kill somebody, your chances are you're going to die before you ever get killed. If that makes sense. Because these processes take so long, and it's not just. There needs to be a less drawn out. Now, granted, I can understand you don't want to condemn the innocent. So if that's the question, I understand. But if it's just legal proceedings and stalling, justice needs to be done and somewhat rapidly, or else it doesn't really deter, and it's not really fair. Finally, there needs to be a consistent application of this, and not so many exceptions one way or the other. Either the person's guilty or they're not guilty. And the number of strange cases that get mixed up where someone's guilty but not really guilty, it needs to be simpler and more consistent than that. Well, justice. Hard issues, tough issues, but really important issues that Israel had to think about, and we do too as well. Well, we're going to pause from our study and encourage you to join us in our Zoom meeting to take prayer requests and go to prayer. So we'll sign off from here and ask that you join us in a couple minutes on Zoom. Good to see you tonight. Have a good evening.